Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the educational program by Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, USA. My name is Momoe Van Braven. I'm a board member of AFPC and a senior correspondent for Nikkei and the English publication Nikkei Asia. Nikkei is Japan's largest business and financial news organization. Today, we have a special guest, and I'm very excited to introduce Gary Weiss, a very good friend of mine and a legendary investigative journalist and author of recent bestseller book, Retail Gangster, the insane real life story of Crazy Eddie. I have a book here too. Let me explain Gary's bio first. Gary has been uncovering Wall Street wrongdoing for nearly 2 decades. His latest book, Retail Gangster, was published by Hachette. Is it Hachette Books, Gary? Is it correct?
You know, like the cutting wood at a Hachette.
Oh, Hachette. Okay. Sorry about that. Hachette Books on August 23rd, 2022, and was greeted by critical acclaim. A native of New York City, he attended public school and Bronx High Schools of Science and graduated from City College and the Medill School of Journalism, Northwestern University. After working as a reporter for the Hartford Courant and news services in Washington, D.C., Gary joined the staff of Barron's in 1984. He moved to Business Week in 1986 and worked there as a writer and investigative reporter through 2004. He was a contributing editor at Condé Nast Porfolio until its closing in 2009. In January 2010, article in the Big Money, the veteran financial writer Roddy Boyd described Gary as among the reporters who have done the epic and heavy lifting in holding American business accountable for problematic practice in the past 20 years. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce Gary Weiss. Gary, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoy being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So to start the interview, I will ask several questions, and everyone, if you have questions, please write it in the message box, and I will present it as the discussion goes on. Okay. So my first question for you, Gary, is could you explain what this book is about and what is Crazy Eddie? Where did this man come from and why is he important?
Well, first again, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it. Well, I'll tell you, if you lived in New York City in the 1980s, you would know Crazy Eddie because he was all over the place. This was an electronics chain, and their advertising was all over the TV. You can get it now on YouTube. I mean, there was remarkable advertising, certainly for the era, and you don't really see it very much anymore. This type of hard sell advertising. The guy would come on and he'd say, you know, Crazy Eddie, our prices are insane. It was like a retailing phenomenon. It was like whatever it was, 43, total of 43 stores throughout the New York area at its peak, all over the place, all over the airwaves. It was considered very cool, very hip, you know, for the baby boomers. This is, we're talking now from the mid 1970s to the 1980s. Now, so it was a retailing phenomenon, a genuine retailing phenomenon, but behind the scenes, from day one, it was fraud. Every conceivable type of fraud that you can imagine, from you name it, they did it. You know, insurance fraud, consumer fraud, and securities fraud. That was the big time. That was the big time of fraud. And that's ultimately what brought them down. They were pretty much gone by the late 80s. And everybody went to prison, almost everybody went to prison. And it was a big mess. But certainly it's the biggest mess, and certainly one of the biggest criminal messes in world history. And that's kind of what brought me to the story.
So describe for us what motivated you to write this story. How did you get the inspiration of writing this book?
Well, I was certainly aware of Crazy Eddie. I didn't write about it when it was taking place, but I mean, I was aware of it. Could not be aware of Crazy Eddie. It was a 1 week long trial. It was in New Jersey for some reason. It was got a lot of publicity on the way up and on the way down. Now, what kind of got me interested was that the guy who was the sort of the turncoat, the whistleblower of the Crazy Eddie fraud. It was basically a family fraud. The Antar family, and one of the Antars, a fellow named Sam Antar, had gone sort of over to the other side, as sometimes happens. You see a fraudster becoming going on to become a good guy, and you actually, there's a whole movie made about it. If you ever saw the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, Catch Me If You Can. It's about a fraudster, Frank Abagnale, who loved my book, by the way. And he gave me a blurb. Frank Abagnale became a good guy, and so did this guy Sam Antar, who was sort of the turncoat, the whistleblower on the of the Antar family. It was a family. It was a family business. And I got to know him because he left a comment on my blog. Back then, blogs were big about 15 years ago. Now it's keeping a blog. And he left a comment on my blog, and I got to know him, and I thought to myself, geez, I mean, he's got a lot of stories to tell. I can, maybe I can turn this into a book. So that's when I started interviewing him. And if you look in the footnotes, everything in this book is carefully footnoted. If you look at the end notes, you will find interviews going back to like 2000 and I guess 2008, maybe 2007, and that's sort of when I began. That's when I began talking to him. I thought, geez, I'm talking to the guy. I'm talking about Crazy Eddie. I'll tape it. I mean, I was considering doing a book that far back.
So you
kind of
interviewed.
The inspiration, so to speak, was access to the whistleblower, I guess.
I see. So this Sam Antar, I guess Crazy Eddie's cousin, right?
Yes, he was sort of the baby cousin of Crazy.
Right.
He grew up in the business.
So did he approach you initially to ask you to write a story about his family and this fraudulent activity?
Well, we kind of talked about it. I don't remember who approached who. He made himself available to me, and I talked to him. I mean, he was interested in. I think he was interested in getting a story out. He already had a blog. He has a blog. It's pretty much the same blog as he had 15 years ago, with a lot of stuff and a lot of interesting material and stuff. But a blog, a website. His website is whitecollarfraud.com. It's a very good website, very informative. It's got a lot of details, got a lot of documents, a lot of stuff. But a website is one thing, but a book telling the whole story is another. And he was happy to cooperate. He gives a lot of lectures. He talks a lot, and he's always on the circuit. He gives a lot of lectures, for instance, to law enforcement. It was sort of a book was sort of the next natural evolution in his thinking, and in my thinking too. I thought, gee, this would be a nice book. Other projects came along, other things sort of got in the way, because I saw in the beginning, I mean, this thing was going to be a really big, massive thing. This is going to require a lot of work, a lot of concentration, and so other things got in the way, but eventually, I did the book.
So in the course of talking with Sam Antar, at what point did you decide to write a story about Crazy Eddie's life? What kind of facts were the trigger for you to feel that, I can write the investigative story about Crazy Eddie?
Well, I felt from the beginning it was obviously a book. I was surprised no one had written a book about it already. It was sort of an obvious book to write. As a matter of fact, I learned that during the trial of Eddie Antar, who was the mastermind, there was this guy, a fairly well-known true crime author. His name escapes me. It's well-known. He actually sat in at the trial with the aim of doing a book. So a book could have come out 20 years ago, but apparently it never gelled for him. There was a chapter on Crazy Eddie in a book called Frankenstein's a Fraud. It came out in 2000. It came out in the year 2000. It came out 22 years ago. So certainly it had been written about, but you know, it was an obvious book to do. It's a very hard book though, because you gotta deal with a whole bunch of things. You want to do a good job, you kind of have to do a lot of. There's just a lot of separate aspects that are sort of not really connected to each other. For instance, you had marketing, wonderful marketing. You have to write about that. That's got really nothing to do with the fraud. Nothing really to do with the fraud. And then even the types of fraud were not always connected to each other. You know, there was warranty fraud. There was accounting. These are things that didn't necessarily have very much in common, but they were all part of the same casserole, shall we say.
Speaking of marketing, you mentioned in other interviews that Crazy Eddie was not only a con man, but also great marketing person.
Yeah.
Tell me about his personality.
Yeah, well, Eddie Antar was the mastermind. You know, he was the, he was the CEO of Crazy Eddie. He was the founder of Crazy Eddie. His family background was, his grandfather was from Aleppo, Syria. His family was Syrian Jewish refugees from Syria who came over around 1920. But a very small, but a very, I would say, a very dynamic aspect of the Jewish community was and is the Syrian Jewish community. Very entrepreneurial people, I would say, who came over around the time of the Ottoman Empire, World War I. A little after World War I, his family came over in 1920. They established themselves very poor at first, but in the old Horatio Alger, as we say, American tradition, they worked hard. They began from nothing and they worked their way up. And Eddie, because the family, believes in helping each other, I would say it's a little bit more like today you would find among, say, Indian Americans than you find among sort of assimilated Jewish people, cohesion among the families. The family comes first, people helping each other, networking. So he was set up in business by his father, who in turn had been set up in business by his father's father. There was a family thing. He was set up in business in Brooklyn in 1969, right at the beginning of like this craze in consumer electronics. Like that was the timing. The timing was extremely good. So they set him up, and he wasn't doing well because it was very hard to get a headway. And he in that business, and he decided, well, I'm going to try to discount. I'm going to discount and I'm going to advertise to attract people to my store. The store is in Brooklyn. I mean, who the hell wants to go out to Brooklyn if you're not there? It was not in a good part of Brooklyn. It was way down in whatever, around Kings Highway. So he just made some very good choices in terms of advertising. Now, in terms of pricing, that was hard because, they had something called the fair trade laws. You couldn't undercut manufacturer prices back then because of the laws that sort of allowed manufacturers to fix prices. He figured out a ways around that. For instance, he used to buy consumer electronics from other retailers. One was operating a numbers bank in the Bronx. These were, not always, Rhodes Scholars and he sometimes used somewhat shady sources to stock his shelves. And a combination of that, being able to get stock his shelves with the product that he needed, plus really unique advertising, making good choices in terms of advertising, and also little things that he did to make up for the fact that he didn't have that much stock. He kind of tended to run out. So that's sort of where the fraud started to kick in. Fraud was involved in the pricing. He charged sales tax of the consumer, but he didn't pass it on. So that gave him a built-in profit margin. It enabled him to keep his prices lower. And there were little games he played with the consumers. So when he ran out of stock, he'd take like goods that had been returned and display models, and he'd sell them to the customers without telling them. And that's not legal. You're not supposed to do that. So that's sort of where the fraud began. But the basis of it was some very good thinking in terms of getting into the marketplace, in terms of marketing, and in terms of supply. But from the very, very beginning, fraud started and sort of in a small way, and it just kept on going and going and going.
Mhm. So tell me the research process of this book. According to the notes in the book, a back page of the book, it looks like, as you mentioned, you spent almost 10 years interviewing and doing research for the book. And you mentioned in the other interviews that this is the most difficult book you ever wrote. Could you explain why?
Well, it was the most difficult book I ever wrote because it was just the most ground to cover. You know, even though I'm writing a book, I don't have unlimited space, nor do I want unlimited space. No one will read it. There was just a lot to cover. Marketing, as I mentioned, marketing, the consumer electronics industry, although I didn't want to, you know, get into that. But there's, you know, the whole history of that and the history of the price fixing that used to go on. And then there were the frauds. And of course, on that, you have to be, you know, you want to tell that in a correct way. And then not all the frauds were necessarily all that easy to explain. You know, some of the frauds, some of the most significant frauds were accounting frauds. Fortunately, I was able to obtain through various sources, because it wasn't always available, you know, all the stuff was available, things that were in the public record, you know, things that can be in the public record without being, shall we say, public, you know, things like court transcripts. Very important. You know, Eddie went on trial. Eddie and his two brothers, Mitchell and Alan, went on trial in 1993, I believe it was, whenever it was, 1982, whenever it was. I don't even remember. They went on trial, and they were well, two of the three were convicted. Eddie was convicted, but they were on trial for like 2 weeks. And, you know, it's very not easy necessarily getting a trial transcript from a 35-year-old trial where the court report is dead and it's not on file anywhere. But, you know, fortunately, from one of the prosecutors was kind enough to give me his copy, which was his electronic copy. And there were also pre-trial depositions in the numerous lawsuits that sprang up around Crazy Eddie. So there was a ton of public record, in addition to which there were court decisions, federal court decisions on these cases, and they were unusually long and detailed. So there was just a lot of written stuff, which aided immeasurably. It wasn't like, you know, I just sat down and talked to Eddie, you know, talked to Sammy Antar, you know, the whistleblower, and just wrote about it. It wasn't like that. There was a lot of material that had to be distilled, and that's part of what made it.
You wrote in detail about the Syrian immigrants, the history of Syrian immigrants. Did you get the chance to go to Syria to do research on the immigration to the United States?
No. I mean, you know, I guess technically I could have, you know, but you know, there's a limit to what you can do, you know, and a limited space, limited money, you know, that kind of thing. No, I mean, that was not the biggest aspect of the book, but there was actually quite a lot of stuff on, you know, and on again in the public record. Ancestry.com has very good census records. It has wonderful naturalization records. And that way I was able to trace a little bit the family arriving, and the various members of the family arriving from Syria. You can see where they came in, what ship they came in on. And in the course of doing this, you know, I was able to sort of research a family scandal among the Antar family. The fact that Eddie Antar's father had a first marriage to an Arab woman, which was very, very controversial in those days. And you couldn't just, you know, because intermarriage was not favored among the Syrian Jewish community, or among Orthodox Jews to this day. You know, I mean, it's a very sensitive issue. It was strictly prohibited. So he not only married a non-Jewish woman, Eddie Antar's father, but he married an Arab woman, which was frowned upon. They had a son. So Eddie Antar, mastermind, he had a half brother. And they later got divorced because, you know, the guy got divorced. Eddie's father got divorced from his first wife. So Eddie Antar, Crazy Eddie, had a half brother in California. And again, through searching through public records, I found that he actually was a Vietnam veteran, and he died in California some years ago, apparently. And this was kind of a family scandal that was talked about in whispers, but I was able to, to substantiate it. And in the course of it, I found that Eddie Antar's father, his first marriage was to a woman who had been a child bride in Lebanon and came over here and got divorced. And, it was like a little interesting details. I couldn't dwell on them. I didn't have the space, but nevertheless, I thought it was kind of interesting. So it's in the book.
There are lots of interesting detail in your book, not only about Crazy Eddie and family itself, but about like old New York, where those Crazy Eddie's family are living on Allen Street, downtown Lower Manhattan.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that the Allen Street had the high, what do you call this, elevated subway train. Now there's nothing, it's just a broad train, a broad road, but it fascinates me to know about this New York history in your book too.
Yeah. The Syrian Jewish community initially settled on Allen Street, which is now sort of a not very marginal part of Lower East Side, maybe Chinatown, whatever. Those days it had an L train. It was half the size of its current size and had an L train over it. Second Avenue, something called the Second Avenue L. Most New Yorkers don't even know it existed. And that's where the Syrian Jewish community settled. It was probably the worst part of the Lower East Side. And the Lower East Side was the worst part of New York. It was the worst part of the worst part of New York. And that's sort of where they settled in their early days, but not for long. The community sort of went en masse to Brooklyn. And that's generally where you find, Syrian Jewish people nowadays in Brooklyn, I guess, the area around like Gravesend, Bensonhurst, and in New Jersey, and in certain parts of New Jersey, Deal, New Jersey, and so forth. But yeah, it was a very humble beginning, and they really worked their way out of that.
And this book described the conversation and action of Crazy Eddie and his family in detail, which sounded like you filmed the scene. Were they mostly true, or more like a dramatization based on the factors you captured from Samantha?
Yeah, well, no, I didn't dramatize. It wasn't necessary actually to dramatize, because there was just so much material that was in the public record, and a lot of what you're describing was, for instance, in pretrial depositions. There was divorce litigation between Eddie Antar and his first wife. Lengthy depositions from back in 1989, 1990, like not too long after the events took place, where conversations were relayed, and you can see in the footnotes. Well, that's where they came from. Again, it came from from depositions, from sworn testimony. I mean, that's the majority of it. Where the conversation involved Sammy Antar, well, it's so footnoted.
Is social media and the internet a good source of information when it comes to do the research for investigative, stories? If you started to write a book maybe 20 years ago, it could have been much more difficult than doing it now.
Well, social media is really not helpful at all. I mean, for instance, there's a Wikipedia article. Like, I don't know if you call that social media. A Wikipedia article is filled on Crazy Eddie, and it's filled with inaccuracies. There is social media, but social media doesn't really help too much. It can point you sometime. I would say in this case, no, not really at all, except that in sort of like marginal ways. I want to spell a word. You go to Google. I wanted some background information on the width of Allen Street. That's the area where it would social media. Well, not really social media, but where the internet would help. Like how wide was Allen Street when there was that L down there. And through Google, I found ancient stuff which gave widths of the street to the inch. But that's not really social media. Social media, that's just Google. Google Books is getting good. They've got some really great old stuff. But social media, nah, not really. Actually, sometimes social media points you in the wrong direction.
So what is the biggest difference between now and maybe 20 years ago when you write the investigating story and do the research?
Well, certainly for this book, I would say really no difference at all, except that, well, nowadays, like I say, Google Books is better than it used to be. You know, Google Books, if you're doing something that looks into the early history of New York, Google Books has some interesting stuff. They have court decisions from the old days.
Mm-hmm.
But this wasn't, you know, so there's, you know, and it can help you in stuff like, as I was mentioning, you know, what's the width of Allen? What was the width of Allen Street in 1920? Well, I can tell you because, you know, Google Books had accurate stuff on that tiny little forgotten fact. But generally speaking, no. I mean, the only things that really helped me with in terms of online research, you know, you have to make a distinction between online research and you know, social media research. Online research was helped by the fact that there are online databases of newspapers, and some of them have very, very good collections of newspapers from localities where Eddie was situated. Therefore, if I wanted to, you know, for instance, the number of stores at any given point in time, I would just look up advertising in, say, 1987 or whenever it was I was looking, and I just simply would count up the number of stores that they had on the ads. And there's no other way of finding out. And sometimes, of course, it's in public documents, but there's really no other way of no, that's really the best way to find out how many stores there are is go on into. But these are proprietary databases of newspapers, and you know, you'd have very good coverage of New Jersey newspapers, Connecticut newspapers, New York Daily News is on these databases. So that helps, but those are online proprietary databases. They're not that expensive, but you know, you have to pay for them. Not social media.
Okay. Since I have been covering financial market, I noticed that financial fraud or conmen always appear after the bubble economy or euphoric financial markets collapsed, such as Enron or Michael Milken, Bernie Madoff, and most recently, some Bankman-Fried of FTX. Did fraudulent service activities of Crazy Eddie come out in the similar situation?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's actually a very good observation, because you know, Crazy Eddie, the securities fraud was the product of a bubble. I mean, two types of bubbles. One was the bubble in consumer electronics, which was a big thing in the early 80s. You know, it was very big, sort of like .com would be in the early 2000s, and then, you know, crypto would be today. It was a big thing. And then there was also a sort of a big thing in sort of a bubble in IPOs, initial public offering. So that gave birth to the securities fraud that Eddie and Sam and, you know, the other people in Crazy Eddie were carrying out. In order to get the best price on their stock when they went public, and they went public in 1984, to get the best price on their stock, they engaged in, you know, inflating their profits, and then that sort of led them down to inflating their profits in subsequent years. But then the bubble burst. You know, you were talking about the bubble burst. Well, the bubble burst in the consumer electronics industry around 1986, 1987. I mean, for the first time, Eddie started getting competitions, you know, because he, in effect, was sort of like creating this competition by competing on prices. Other stores came by and they were competing on prices. So there was sort of like this burst the bubble. And because the bubble burst, he could no longer sustain the fraud, and that ultimately led to his downfall. And it's very similar. It's a really good point. That's basically what happened to Madoff. You know,
it was fascinating to know that those during IPO bubble and consumer bubble, when you describe in a book, and all of those investment bankers were so excited about, you know, issuing IPO of Crazy Eddie's company, just like during subprime crisis here in New York, 2007-8, rating agency put AAA for some subprime based mortgage-backed securities. So this is very similar situation, and those analysts, financial institutions analysts, are raving about how good company is Crazy Eddie's company, right?
Oh yes, they're very, very big with Wall Street analysts. Shameless puffery came out of their reports. Eddie was very good at cultivating analysts, and he hired a PR guy, a very good PR guy named Ed Colleton, who helped him out. He had wonderful public relations and press relations when it counted. Yeah, no question.
So the community in Wall Street and the people don't learn much from the past history, and the history repeats all the time when it comes to this financial fraud and illegal activities.
Yeah, well, that's because fraud never looks like fraud until it's too late. Right. Sam Bankman-Fried is a really good example. I mean, really nobody of consequence really was saying. You had a few people on the fringes who were saying, he's a fraud. Usually, some of the people who say some of the people on the fringes of the financial community were saying, Sam Bankman-Fried is a fraud. But they're the kind of people who say that everybody's a fraud. So they didn't have much credibility. Nobody of any real credibility was able to pick up his being a fraud. I believe Michael Lewis, the well-known financial journalist, was actually embedded with Sam Bankman-Fried. Now, I don't know whether he ever picked up on it, but I would be surprised if he did. Lots of people just didn't know that he was a fraud until after the bubble burst and after the fraud was exposed. It's very rare that you have a situation where during a fraud, somebody of consequence is saying, "Wait a second, there's a fraud going on." It happened during Madoff to some extent, but basically it doesn't happen much. People don't know.
Yeah.
You can't really expect them to know either, mostly.
You dedicate this book to, it says, for the victims. And who are the biggest victims, affected by Crazy Eddie? Well,
I guess, I said to the victims because, to be honest with you, I wasn't sure who to dedicate it to. I mean, like, who are you going to dedicate a book like this to? In my previous books, I dedicated to my wife, my previous books. And I wanted to find someone new to dedicate the book to. So I was thinking, well, the victims. Who are the victims? Well, the victims, I guess, would be society as a whole. Because what Eddie did was, I think Eddie kind of victimized the marketplace. He made fools of people buying his stock. I guess the shareholders were victimized. His customers were victimized to a certain extent because, first of all, he didn't have the lowest prices. He advertised, we got the lowest prices. He didn't have the lowest prices. And a lot of the customers he cheated. Not all of them, though. You can't say his customers were all victims. No. So a certain subset of his customers. A lot of his victims were not very sympathetic people. Insurance companies, for instance, were his victims. He victimized insurance companies. Who cares? But he did. He victimized his insurance companies. He victimized manufacturers because he committed warranty fraud. He was constantly ripping off the electronics makers through the fraud that he committed in making warranty claims. So. He had victims. I feel, though, that his main victim was society in a way, because he just I think tampered with the public perceptions of the market. He was very cynical, and he got rich by breaking the law, and those were his victims.
Did the victim sue Crazy Eddie's for fraudulent activity or some class action lawsuit or something happened?
There were quite a number of lawsuits. He went bankrupt, so the bankruptcy trustee, as with Madoff, the bankruptcy trustee was responsible for getting as much assets as possible from Eddie and his kinfolk and other people who benefited from the fraud, getting the assets, many of which were distributed throughout the world, getting those assets and giving them to aggrieved shareholders. And that was his job. And he did a pretty good job. He got, I forget, I think it was 120 million. He got a lot of money. He got enough to make whole shareholders to a large extent. And there were also class action suits back and forth. The accounting firms who audited Crazy Eddie's books were sued because they didn't do the greatest job in auditing. Eddie would engage in all kinds of flagrant efforts to boost the value of his assets in order to keep the stock price higher. So we do all kinds of stupid things right in front of the auditors. So people sued the auditors. And for the most part, these lawsuits were not successful because it's hard. It's hard to sue, to engage in this class action suit. Congress over the years has made it harder and harder to sue corporations in class action lawsuits.
And what about his first wife? She couldn't get anything from Crazy Eddie, right?
Yeah, I was a victim for him. His first wife, Debbie won. He married twice. Debbie, there was one Debbie, and then there was another Debbie. He liked the name Debbie, I guess. He really just completely swindled his ex-wife. She was entitled to a fair divorce settlement. She divorced him in right around 1984, 1985. She divorced him, and she was just taken to the cleaners. He just completely, totally screwed her over in the court settlement. And there was a scathing. One of the more interesting documents was a decision that was handed down in the divorce case, which was sealed, but eventually over time it became public, and that was a scathing and very interesting court decision. But she was awarded a certain sum of money. She was awarded her proper fair share of the assets, and Eddie just didn't pay. He was judgment proof. He never paid, and she continued to sue him. And she, even after he died in 2016, she continued suing. She sued another of the people involved in her situation with Eddie, and that lawsuit was still alive as of 2018. She got another judgment. It was a worthless judgment, but she was still fighting for her fair share as late as 2018. She's never going to collect a cent. Never.
Is she still alive?
Yeah. And she wouldn't talk to me. But that's the way it goes. I had a lot of deposition testimony, so I sort of had what I needed, but I wanted to talk to her, but she wouldn't talk to me. What can you do?
Most of those con or Ponzi scheme people, some illegal personnel in Wall Street, they have some kind of a charm in their personality. That's why they attract potential victim. Did you find Crazy Eddie some kind of interesting and charming personality?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's no question about it. He had. Certainly among his employees, he had almost a cult-like, influence over them. He really knew how to get the loyalty of the people working for him. They just loved Eddie. To this day, they love Eddie. I mean, you go on. You were mentioning social media. There certainly are. There's social media consisting of former Crazy Eddie employees, and these are people for the most part who have nothing but affection for Crazy Eddie, for Eddie Antar. I went to his grave in Staten Island. He's buried at a cemetery in Staten Island, and his grave is covered with stones. And in Jewish practice, you put a stone when you visit somebody's grave. It's considered, it's part of ritual, you
Yeah.
put a stone on the grave. If you've seen the movie Schindler's List,
Yeah.
Schindler's grave is covered with stones because it was very frequently visited and the man is adored. Well, just like Schindler, Eddie Antar's grave is covered with stones. You know, people visit, people, even after his death, they admire him. And, you know, there's no question he had a charm, he had a magnetism about him that attracted people, you know, gulled people, and persuaded people to work with him on the fraud. That was part of his charm, and that he was able to convince people out of loyalty and just out of sheer persuasion to do things that they really shouldn't have done. Like, for instance, you know, like, you know, you're supposed to accurately count what's in warehouses. You know, that's not just etiquette. You know, you accurately count what's in warehouses so that your financial statements are accurate. You know, if you inflate what's in warehouses, you inflate your profits. And Eddie knew that. Most people don't really know that. Most people are not aware that this is a principle of accounting, that, you know, they profits are calculated on a formula that takes into account what's in your inventories at the end of a fiscal period. Most people don't know this. Even the people who ran the warehouses didn't know this. You charm them and say, well, yeah, could you inflate the warehouse? I want you to add another $1 million to the warehouses. Yeah, it's good for the company. You have to do it. And the guys who worked in the warehouse, they didn't know that. Even the manager of the warehouse was a basically honest guy. He wasn't. You know, Eddie asked me as well. It takes a real charm and a magnetism to get people to commit fraud like that.
That's interesting. So what did you learn most from writing this book as an investigative journalist?
Well, I think I learned a lot about human nature, really. You know, I learned a lot about, you know, well, you know, as you were saying about fraud, you know, why do people commit frauds? Not for their own self, not for their own personal enrichment, but why would you commit frauds for someone else's enrichment? It's part of your job, you know, where you're taking a significant risk. Why would you do that? You know, why would you throw caution to the winds? So I sort of learned, you know, and because the book is telling the story through people. So by telling the story through people, even people who were dead, even people who wouldn't talk to me, I was able, through the public record, through their own words, usually, to get a sense as to what motivated people to commit frauds when they themselves were not the beneficiaries, when the company was the beneficiaries, when a friend was the beneficiary. And also a little bit about, and also sort of brought home to me, you know, the importance of family values, you know, how families can be the center of frauds. In this case, the entire family, you know, the fraud was centered around a small group of people who were related to each other largely by marriage and by, you know, by blood and by marriage. So, you know, it's a story of family. It's also a story it's also a story of betrayal, because, you know, along with the fraud, along with the trust and the cultural-like devotion came betrayal. I mean, Eddie betrayed pretty much everybody. You know, he fled eventually, you know, when the things got hot, he fled to Israel. He was expecting that he would be able to get a safe haven in Israel, but Israel had other ideas. They didn't, this guy. So he was extradited. But he betrayed everybody. He betrayed Israel. You were talking about victims. One of his biggest victims was Israel. You know, he lied to get access. He became an Israeli citizen, and he also had one of his aliases become an Israeli citizen. He violated Israeli law in a big way, you know. And you know, the state of Israel was one of his victims. He betrayed the state of Israel.
What fascinates you to be an investigative journalist, to uncover Wall Street wrongdoing?
Well, it's a living, you know. It's you know, investigative journalism is just the same as ordinary journalism, except that it probes things a little deeper and sometimes deals with things that are well, maybe a little bit unpleasant sometimes to obtain, dealing somewhat with the muck and mire of life. That's kind of what investigative journalism is. Not that much different in many respects. If you're going to report something, you obtain the information and you write about it. But investigative journalism has to dig sort of deeper and gets into the dirt a little more than other kinds of journalism, although I think basically it's all the same.
So what is the recipe for becoming a great investigative journalist? Do you need to have certain personal traits?
Well, actually, the main thing you need to do investigative journalism, any journalism, is someone who will pay you to do it. I would say that's the main thing, and that's harder and harder to obtain. It's easy to become an investigative journalist and say, "Hey, I'll pay you X amount of money to write about such and such." Hey, voila, you're an investigative journalist. And then will they stand behind you? To a certain extent, investigative journalism, you have to remember, is a team effort. You have to have someone hire you. They have to stand behind you if things get hot. And then your own personal qualities of doing the job. For example, I don't want to name names, but after I did the book, somebody approached me to do a very challenging investigative piece. And he told me what a great, this is something you'll love. And I said, well, how much are you going to pay me for this? And then he gave me the sum, and I got to make a living. The ingredient that he was neglecting in the investigative reporting equation was money to me. Investigative journalism is a team effort. You need a good lawyer, usually. I had a fine lawyer vet the manuscript. You need a lawyer to see that you haven't, committed libel, God forbid, libel. But in terms of personal traits, you have to be willing to dig beneath the surface. You have to be willing to go through a lot of documents because a lot of work. It's very bad on the eyes. You have to go through a lot of documents, preferably documents. Documents are much better than interviews, because if somebody said something in writing, probably under oath, it's always better than when somebody tells you something, because the memories fade. But if you have something in writing, it's always best. And also, you sort of have to be sure you're not being played or used as a tool. Frequently somebody will come to you and say, well, I've got this great exclusive for you. We have a wonderful investigative thing for you. It's really great. I'm picking you to do this. Why me? What do you want to get out of it? All too often, much of what passes for investigative reporting is where a journalist lets himself be used. Some journalists have reputations for being used. Again, I don't want to name names, but you want to be sure you're not being used, and you also want to be sure that you're telling the truth to the best of your ability. It requires a certain amount of judgment, that you're not being manipulated by your sources. I've been manipulated by my sources. I've had sources leave out important information, not with Crazy Eddie. I'm talking in the past. I've had sources leave out important information that would have changed somewhat the thrust of an article. That happens. You have to look out for it, though.
This is a technical question, but you mentioned that investigative journalism is a team effort. So you, as a freelance independent journalist, when you write the story, you have, and then as you mentioned, you have to have a good lawyer. So you have to hire a lawyer and maybe research assistant or something that
the person hiring you needs to get the lawyer. I'm not hiring a lawyer, but the person who's hiring you should usually have when warranted, needs to have a good lawyer. That's important.
I see. Okay, but so when you decide to write a book, you usually started to write a book before finding publisher, or publisher come to you and, Gary, can you write a story about Crazy Eddie or something like that?
Well, in the case of Crazy Eddie, it was a question of getting the material together and then finding a publisher. In the case of this book, it was such a big project. I was, in the course of working on Crazy Eddie, I was involved in 2 other projects. There was another book, and then I was working for Time for I was working for Portfolio magazine, and that kind of diverted me. And before I could go back, and I was working on other things. So you kind of juggle stuff. But no, you want to establish that you have do a certain amount of reporting prior to be able to convince the publisher that you can do it. In this instance, the sort of the catalyst was Eddie's death in 2016. I kind of I'd been working on it, and then Eddie died, so there was a certain amount of spate of publicity over Eddie. So that's why I began at that point to work on the thing with greater alacrity at that point.
So are you working on the new book right now?
Well, I'm sort of tossing around some things. I'm juggling a couple of things. It's not like I can discuss, but
I know
a couple of things.
Yeah. Is it going to be something very new, different from Crazy Eddie?
Oh, it'll be different from Crazy Eddie. Yeah. Okay. There's only one Crazy Eddie. It has to be different from Crazy Eddie.
Well, I'm looking forward to it once it comes out. And I guess we don't see any questions here from audience. So I guess we're gonna finishing up this program. But do you have, Gary? Do you have any message to journalists around the world, because this is foreign, press correspondents gathering? So message that encourage us to write a good story.
Well, no, not really. I think people sort of have to. I think usually, sometimes I get queries saying, "How do I become an investigative journalist?" Well, I don't know. I mean, just continue to do what you're doing. Look for stories that are worth doing, and that it might be a little complicated or a little difficult. That's all. And then try to find someone to pay you to do them. That's right. Very important.
Great. Well, Gary, it has been a great education to us as a reporter like me, as well as a regular citizen. And thank you very much for your time. And I'm looking forward to reading another book when it comes out.
Thank you very much. And of course, people should remember that the title of the book is...
Yes, and I have the book too.
Gangster. It's insane.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. And
thank you.
We will see you at another educational program.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.